Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
And today we are going to be excavating this notion of anxiety, and we're going to be doing it through a Jungian lens.
So I think all of us have a sense of what it feels like to be anxious. And I also think that we all know that there are tremendous gradations of anxiety, everything from just a little nagging nervousness up to people feeling like they're shaking or their bowels are evacuating or that they're crying, or perhaps even at the far end, passing out or dissociating because the anxiety gets so hot.
Fear, I think fear and anxiety are different.
Unpack
You do?
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
How do you differentiate that?
So anxiety, I think, is sort of like a low level, it's sort of like a background feeling of just discomfort and edginess. I mean, I'm not saying it's not really uncomfortable, but I think that fear is something different that comes with kind of like a program for action. Like when you're afraid, just think about the difference between you're home alone and, your spouse is out of town and you hear a window break and someone reach through and open the door. That's fear. That's not anxiety.
I'm thinking about things like panic attacks, however, and I would put that in the category of fear. That the system is adrenalized, overtaken, person is shaking, feels often like he or she her life is at risk and going to die. How will I live through this? But I do differentiate sometimes fear from anxiety in that fear is external, like the saber-toothed tiger is about to pounce down upon you. And anxiety, even a panic attack, is internal.
I agree with that. I think the cleanness of fear is that I am responding to an immediate situation that's right in front of me. Anxiety is something that's stewing in the psyche.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Still, the physical symptoms can be overwhelming. But I think it was right to bring up this distinction between fear and anxiety, and that we are particularly talking about this internal experience that can certainly reaches into the body of anxiety.
But it does really, I think, one of the things that you're saying, which I think is accurate, is that anxiety tends to be generated by our thoughts rather than an external stimuli, right?
Well, I think the cognitive therapists in the audience just gave up a rousing cheer when you said that, to think, because for it to be generated by thinking means that it is exclusively a function of the ego and that it's a conscious issue. But I think there's much evidence to suggest
I'm not.
That it's not.
You can't. You're putting words in my mouth. Just because it comes from our thoughts doesn't mean it's ego only.
So we're talking about unconscious thoughts.
Well, or both, or some territory in between the two. The unconscious influences what we think, and what we think influences the unconscious.
Sure, but I think inherent in thought is that there is a kind of bright light, that there is an apperception of it.
More to think
be
about.
That as it may be. So what do we do? So as we're talking about this, perhaps we'll start by kind of typifying the quality of the anxiety as we then talk about how it might be approached, because I think it's quite different between having a panic attack or just feeling a little nervous going for an interview. They probably deserve different responses.
Yeah, and obviously anxiety is one of the big issues that a lot of people identify with. Brings a lot of people into therapy. It's a miserable feeling to walk around with all the time.
Oh, it's just severe anxiety can be simply awful. And usually the person knows. For example, agoraphobia, which is the fear of going out, or that you can go out to a certain parameter, but you can't leave your town or you can't leave your neighborhood. And the person, quote, knows unquote, better, but still cannot master this. And people often say, I know this isn't real. I know there's no danger, going out beyond my neighborhood, for example, but I just can't, which often leads us into what is going on unconsciously, what is not conscious, what is being represented symbolically by this example of I cannot go beyond certain geographic parameters. I can't get on an airplane, big dogs. The list is really tremendous of where the anxiety gets projected, of what's dangerous.
So we're talking about beginning over time with an analysis to map the psyche and their complexes, that there are certain specific images and memories and physical states associated, in this example, with leaving the house that are still able to stimulate very uncomfortable physical states, and that it's such a powerful feedback loop, and particularly because it lays below the threshold of awareness, or at least the pivotal elements do.
Yes. It's just worth lifting up. I mean, we've talked a little bit about what's the difference between fear and anxiety. What's the difference between a panic attack and fear? I just want to say that what you're talking about in part sounds like a phobia.
Yes.
Which feels, again, a little different to me than anxiety. I mean, they're obviously related, but I just want to sort of lift that up because I think I might tend to respond differently to something that feels like a discrete phobia than a kind of constant anxiety that someone's marinating in, that someone just kind of walks around with that's very generalized.
We'll talk about your
that's
marinade.
What it's called is generalized anxiety disorder.
Right. Yes.
In a manual
Yeah.
Versus something that has a specific focus.
Yes.
So Deb gave us a picture of phobia. So when you talk about this atmosphere of anxiety, how do you conceptualize that?
Well, you started wondering about the kind of symbolic meaning of a phobia, like if someone can't go beyond a certain border, for example. And I do think that would be particularly important because the content is so important. It's like, I'm scared of big dogs, right? And I would be curious about, so what about big dogs? But I think that, what Jung might say about anxiety is it's that sort of regressive pull, kind of not to grow up, not to face the dragon. This is actually what he talks a lot about in his book, Symbols of Transformation. It's that you have to kind of work up the courage to get out of the regressive pull that kind of brings you back down almost to sort of an infantilized state where you're not going to get out of bed that morning, kind of so to speak.
So you're talking about ego strength.
In part.
Of having a strong enough ego that says, I'm going to face this particular dragon. I'm going to get up out of bed. I'm going to not cross the street if I see a big dog. Find some way to override the regressive fear feeling.
Right, to enter into that heroic attitude.
Exactly.
If we view it as a developmental crisis and that the anxiety is part of developing in a particular way.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that can happen, particularly with, kids or teens or young people, is it's so easy to want to say, oh, well, if it makes you that afraid, then don't do it. And I'm not saying that that's never the answer. There's certainly things, listen, I don't want to jump out of an airplane. Okay. And I'm not planning on doing it. I have no desire to do that. I don't need to conquer that fear. But in general, when we have someone who's very anxious, I think that there can be sort of a secondary gain around that because it kind of gives you an excuse to stay out of life. And that the answer is no, you gotta get out there. What always comes to my mind when I talk about this is, the original Star Wars, when they're in the garbage compactor room. If you don't push back against your fears, your life becomes like that garbage compactor room. And the walls just close in and get smaller and smaller and smaller. So in some sense, every single day, we have to face our fears so that our life stays open.
And what does it take to face our fears? I always have a tremendous amount of empathy for people who have anxieties about specific things or life in general. it's such a painful place for people to be. And it sounds a little, I agree with you, but it sounds a little simplistic of, okay, we have to face our fears, we have to slay our particular dragons. And yet there's a process.
Yes, there is.
How do we work with people? What does it take? And where I go immediately is simply to relationship. And to really make it really concrete. What if there were a child who was afraid of large dogs? We certainly would not tell that child,
go out there and face the big dogs.
There's this big, mean-looking Great Dane or something out there. You're on your own. We would provide support. And I think that people who are anxious need a kind of support.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. It's about the relationship.
That they are too alone in something that is too big. And they need someone who will look at it and understand and face it with them, not in a literal way, but what is going on. Something very important is happening in the psyche that says you can't get on an airplane, or big dogs are dangerous. Riding the subway is a terrible experience. All these things that needs to be understood. Something needs to be befriended here.
And it might really actually require an other.
Yes.
That's supportive. I mean, I'm certainly not saying, oh, you're afraid of the water, let's throw you in the deep end, There's
a wonderful quote by Rilke, a poet, a German poet, that says that everything that is scary and awful and monstrous in the world, it really is a princess who wants to be rescued and befriended. And so I'm thinking that what part of the anxious client and where the fear comes up needs to be understood and befriended and taken by the hand and helped to face the fear.
Well, I think that is a very helpful developmental approach, viewing the child's, the adolescent's regressed aspect and partnering it and introducing it to the world, and particularly introducing it to an adult world with an adult attitude and with an adult sense of confidence. I've also seen and found it very kind of miraculous that anxiety that comes up in people who present as reasonably successful in the world often really is a defense against a deeper piece of information that is simply so disturbing to them. So I'll talk about one example. Now, this was a young person in their late teens who came in with the family because he was developing some substantial sleep disorder. Could not fall asleep, could not get themselves to sleep, highly, highly agitated. And it was creating a real problem in a lot of different areas. And as we began working, what began to emerge is that one of the parents had become in the last few years extremely aggressive, extremely critical, and deeply intimidating to the young person. What emerged finally in one of the sessions, as I kind of named the problem in the aggressive parent, is that the young person piped up and shouted about how furious they were at the parent for treating them so badly. And in that one moment, it released so much energy in this young person that their sleep disorder totally evaporated. That was the end of it, and they slept fine.
So it was like that was what they needed to find, kind of?
They needed to own that it was so threatening to the young person to actually experience their anger or to confess their anger to an authority figure who was so threatening to them, that the suppression of that created an enormous amount of anxiety and introduced what was really a kind of atmosphere of anxiety and pacing, because the anger at the parent was kept very far away from the conscious attitude.
That reminds me of this quote by Jung that I just love so much, where he says that a neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. And I think there is a way that sometimes anxiety is sort of that thing that distracts us away from the thing that we really need to be paying attention to, but might be too painful or too threatening.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm on your word of suppression, of your client who suppressed his angry feelings toward the parent. And when those angry feelings were released, it was really curative, in a manner of speaking.
Remarkably.
And I wonder often about, is it easier to be afraid and to avoid than it may be to be in touch with anger or aggression? Mm-hmm. Aggression is often the thing that is forbidden and which people are afraid of. So I'm thinking about big dogs, for example, comes up sometimes, leaving the safe environment of, will my feelings be out of control? Where's the big dog part of me that would like to bite people? Do I have to, a sort of part of self that suppresses in the interest of control?
Mm-hmm,
lest I get out of control with feelings that are even worse than my fear may be more acceptable to the ego.
Mm-hmm. So coming down to working with this with a client, one of the things that I hear emerging is that there are many different ways of approaching the fear depending on the level of maturity of the client, psychological maturity, the age, the life experience, and our own clinical experience about where we feel that the mystery around the anxiety leads, whether or not that is an existential issue and there's a need to connect to an archetypal core that allows them to organize their thrust forward into life, whether it's a young need to be introduced to life by a strong internalized parental figure that's positive and can orient them towards these unfamiliar tasks, whether it's an environment where it's safe enough to admit something that's being hidden away, but has so much energy that it will not yield until it has its acknowledgement, its due. Mm-hmm. And all of this also shows up in the dream life. We'll see figures that are often very frightening or very ambivalent, or figures in the dream that are defended against.
Yeah, I think a lot of times anxiety is a kind of defense. And in dreams, frightening figures often are not actually frightening, but are pure threatening because we're defending against them. Yes, so they have this kind of...
They're carrying a message or a quality or even an experience when they're engaged imaginatively that the ego senses will make a demand on it. Mm-hmm. And right now, it doesn't even have the attitude or the familiarity to tolerate the demand.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about the anxiety and the fear often brings people in a person's family or others that close to the person into an empathic or sympathetic place of that the person is suffering, is in pain, and is non-threatening. And we feel bad for so-and-so who has such difficulty with this or that or the other thing, like your client, of his family brought him in because he was really having such a...
tended to him.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. It brings people into the tend and befriend place, whereas the aggression, the anger, tends to alienate people, and that there's a huge relational component often to anxiety of what is acceptable in a relationship and what will create abandonment or rejection, including by self, of things that I don't approve of for myself, for example. So there are feelings here. It's a long way around, but there are feelings that are unacceptable to the person that have been suppressed or repressed.
You know, when I'm shifting a little bit here, but one of the things I really notice, and maybe you guys do too, is so many people enter treatment saying, I have depression and anxiety, or I have anxiety. And it's just such a kind of, I don't know, sort of normalized way to construct our experience. And I don't know that I think that's totally helpful, because it has become this kind of way that we imagine our emotional life that externalizes this a little bit. I mean, feeling unsettled or worried is kind of just a part. It's a very normal part of being human. And when you give it this sort of quasi-medicalized name, which, is not so quasi-medicalized because you can go to a psychopharmacologist and get medication for being anxious, it kind of moves it into a different realm. And I do hear some people talk about, well, I have anxiety, and it's sort of like, and therefore I can't, which again, I don't know how helpful that is. So I'm just tracking that too.
Yeah, I think this idea of over-pathologizing a range of very human experience, that it's normal to feel in the course of a day challenged and a little nervous about something, or disappointed and a little deflated about something. And if we have somehow communicated to the culture or to a generation of people that they should always be happy or they should always feel tucked in and safe, that we haven't done them a service.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that I think is a question that's happening among college professors as they are observing the magnitude of request that incoming freshmen, kids right out of high school, have to be soothed and held and have stress and challenges removed from them, that the capacity to tolerate or even normalize a certain amount of anxiety is not being held correctly.
That there isn't that expectation that people are going to do that. But I want to say, Joseph, I've certainly read of those stories in the popular press about, college students and trigger warnings and safe spaces and all this stuff. Is this something, it's only something I've read about. I don't have professors coming in with these stories, and I don't have young people coming in with this either. Is this something you've actually seen?
I have colleagues that are working in mental health centers at the universities and have done that for, I can think of one colleague that I talk with that's been there about 15 years, so can really talk about this kind of arc that they're noticing, or a trend. And I do have several friends that are professors, and even the incidences of bringing different kinds of devices or stuffed animals or even live animals into the classroom as soothing devices just on the first day of class, that this has increased exponentially.
So students are bringing stuffed animals to class?
Yes, as comfort objects.
Huh.
And in a way that is much more pronounced than it had been in the past.
That's fascinating.
So this could go to your theory, Lisa, that there is a kind of failure in the culture in general to prepare people for their heroic tasks, and a heroic task of just being alone and going to college and thriving that way. And your comment, Deb, about developmental failures and the need for an internalized, strong parent that can introduce them to the world, and that these needs are now being laid on the college environment to provide these services or accommodations, which I think is more problematic. Because I don't know that it's really initiatic to indulge this to an excessive degree.
Well, it encourages avoidance, and we know that avoidance is the worst thing for anxiety.
Yes, exactly. And avoidance and the externalization, the projection of anxiety onto the environment, that we have to beware of trigger words or some such thing. We need sort of like a pacifier in the form of a stuffed animal that I take to class at age 18 or 19 or 20. It's the wrong solution. The solution lies within, not out there. The environment is always going to be the environment.
That's a really good way of putting it.
It's not something where the world has to change to meet your needs. Somehow, how do we help people find the wherewithal internally to companion themselves and be in the world with the fear or anxiety or whatever else it is, but to still be present?
And to properly interpret the environment, that things are being interpreted as threatening, which are not threats.
Yes, and we could reinforce
really
a real victim culture here with young people in college feeling that the world needs to meet their needs. There's a real maturational task going on here that can be avoided, and it's unfortunate if that happens.
And, I want to say, though, because one could listen to us talking over the past couple minutes and say that we're unkind and unempathic. But I want to circle back to where you were a few minutes ago talking about the relationship. And when we have someone, for example, we're working with someone who's struggling with an anxiety, certainly we don't just say, well, go out there and kill your dragon. What are you doing? Come on, get out of my office, right? We offer ourselves as companions in whatever way that means. I'm not literally suggesting that we...
Psychological
companions,
And we also do deep work. That when someone comes in and says that they have a particular anxiety, we do over time ask them to relax into it, to be able to verbalize the images that are around the anxiety, the memories, the body states, and begin to develop a relationship to that, both as their analyst and for themselves, so that we can introduce language and ideas that we hope will help them shift around these images and reach under them to some images that are much more provocative but need to be looked at.
So maybe just to close this part, if I can get the last word, Jung said this great thing about how we don't solve our problems, but we grow larger than them. And I think that's part of what you're talking about, that around an anxiety, it may not be that, one day we fixed it, but we come into a new relationship with it, and that shifts something in a meaningful way.
Yes.
So does it make sense to move over to the dream?
It does.
Let's do that. So, one of our listeners has shared a dream, a 42-year-old female.
And the dream is it's a repeated dream for many years about human feces. And that's the dream.
And that's it? Just about human feces, no particulars?
It's a repeated dream. And what does she say there? Human feces in different forms.
Repeated dreams for many years about human feces in different forms. Yeah, it took me a while to kind of find that on the page. But gosh, I wish the person was in front of us, because if that were in my office, I would be asking them to break down the dreams. And what I would say is, when people tell me they have repeated dreams, as we relax into it, the dreams, although they may have a similar central figure, really are different.
Oh, of course.
There's a different surrounding or a different person, or as she said, feces in different forms. And all of these nuances can suggest something changing and different in the psyche.
Yes.
I'm going to the generalization here of human feces in different forms that aren't specified. And I'm wondering, that's the first thing that comes up for me, is if this person were in my office, I would be wondering about this tendency, or if there's a tendency to sort of glaze something over in a generalized way of just human feces in different forms, without the specificity, without specific imagery, because without that, there may not be any specific feelings about it. There's no relationship. There's a real distance. I could say it's about clouds of different kinds in the sky.
But what's interesting is the way that we received this dream. There's sort of a parallelism with the content of the dream, because we received it in this way in which we're commenting on it's sort of undifferentiated.
Yes.
And in fact, feces is, in the sort of language of alchemy, sort of the prima materia, that which is undifferentiated. So, it's sort of like this, the dream itself in that way is sort of like feces.
Yes.
And I'm not putting the dream down. But
that's exactly it. It's undifferentiated. And the dreamer feels, just in the generalized content that we have, very distant from something that is a very vivid symbol. People do dream about shit.
All the time.
And overflowing toilets or different kinds of places and so on. And there's often a lot of pretty intense feeling about, can I talk about this? This is a really weird dream. I'm not comfortable. Whereas this dreamer is elevated and distanced above it. It's very generalized content. She's far away from it, I think.
Well, I was aligning with the first part of that sentence, where how shameful or embarrassing is it for somebody to talk about a dream like that? And even with a client in the office, I can think of many people, the first time they bring in a feces dream or urination dreams, they're very shy, and that I have to really kind of encourage them to come forward with the details and demonstrate a kind of grounded clinical attitude towards it.
And that it's symbolic.
Yes.
And so what are some of the symbolic possible meanings here of feces?
And being confronted by it, that the unconscious keeps saying repeatedly, look at this, look at this, look at this, in different forms. And what is perhaps her resistance to it?
I'm thinking about black gold of the compost, and people get the worms, and you put your garbage in this particular composting box, and the worms eat the garbage, and then their feces becomes soil that you can use in your garden as a very good fertilizer for new growth. So the point being that this can be a fertilizing and regenerative symbol. Human feces have been used to fertilize crops, to fertilize gardens. So in the distancing, or what I'm perceiving as a distancing from feces, is a distancing also from the positive aspects of feces.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, one of the great things about looking at things symbolically like this is it does sort of rinse some of the shame away and makes it possible to relate to the positive aspects. But, I mean, shit is shit, and it smells, and it's disgusting, and it's that which is not needed by the body. It's been kind of cast out as waste, and it can breed disease. It can be filthy in that sense. So, there's sort of negative stuff there too. It might be that some of it needs to be sort of, flushed away, as it were.
Absolutely. Not everything can be integrated or used. And some things do need to be flushed away and gotten rid of. But without more closeness to the symbol, we can't tell what these repeated dreams mean. And the dreamer's psyche keeps saying, pay attention to this, pay attention to this, pay attention to this. And all we have is this sort of umbrella human feces in different forms.
Right. Yes. Right. And I'm thinking about the diagnostic phenomena of examining feces. That, for instance, if we're out in the forest, if we see a pile of scat, by taking a moment just to observe it, you can surmise, oh, this was a bear, oh, this was a coyote, or this was a deer in that way. That can give us information. And even in terms of human feces will tell us whether or not we're sick or whether or not we're digesting things correctly. It tells us what we're casting off. And although that is kind of takes a lot of objectivity, but what's coming out of us tells us how well we are integrating and absorbing things.
We need to get closer to it to see what the meaning might be in it, whether it's a literal physical level of a diagnosis, a problem, something that can be informative in that way, or at the other end of the spectrum, symbolically for this particular
I was thinking
person.
Symbolically in this way.
I was thinking about them. I was thinking medically and physically, as well as
it's a metaphor. Right?
It's a metaphor.
It's a metaphor.
There are some like important kind of mythological correlates, right? Doesn't excrement sort of factor in? Isn't there a Roman goddess or something?
There is Cloacina, who is the goddess of the cloaca. And in some animals, I'm thinking chickens, but I could be wrong.
Maybe all birds. I think it's all birds.
The orifice and the opening for fertilization and creating new life, and for excrement and urination are the same. There is one opening that serves both functions of what can go in to fertilize and what comes out as waste material. And it's called a cloaca. And sewers are cloacas. I don't know that anything comes in, but the Romans had this, and this was the goddess of purification.
Purification.
What do we
that's
do with a
interesting.
sewer? We get rid of the waste material. And Cloacina was the goddess of purification in sewers.
I think there was an Aztec goddess who consumed human excrement and was purified in that way. Does that sound right to you?
Well, I think that she acted in a purifying way. So if I remember correctly, that there's a way in which she was thought to eat her own excrement, and as it passed through her a second time, it would leave her body in the form of a flower.
And isn't there some South American, I don't know if it's Aztecs or Mayans, where gold was considered the excrement of the sun, and of course it was highly valued, and only the upper class could have gold or wear gold. So there's value in excrement.
And doesn't it? What is the alchemical expression? The philosopher's stone is found in the dung heap. Is that correct? Something like that.
Yeah.
So that's where the treasure is found. Is in the shit.
So might we want to actually encourage or suggest to this dreamer, get a little closer, see if you can capture more detail in some of these dreams that you have repeatedly about feces. There may be some real value in them for you.
Sounds like a good idea.
Absolutely.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.